I'll just hand you over to Ms Jane Annear. Jane is the manager of our criminal target assessment team, and she's going to focus on some recent approaches to risk assessing targets. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be presenting on recent approaches to threat assessment from Australian Crime Commission perspective. And the presentation will cover, just so you can pace yourself, how threat assessment fits into the contemporary law enforcement environment, the Australian law enforcement context and the place of the Australian Crime Commission within it, how the ACC's unique role has impacted on the way that we've developed our risk assessment methodology, and the role that the ACC's target risk assessment methodology has in shaping nationally coordinated responses to the threat posed by serious and organised crime. Law enforcement seems to need to stretch itself further and further all the time to exercise some control over the constantly evolving criminal environment. Law enforcement agencies are seeing new crime types, new drugs and new criminal methodologies emerging constantly, each of which require a response from law enforcement. At the same time, law enforcement is increasingly required to do more with less as the public purse shrinks. In addition, law enforcement is increasingly accountable both to the public and the government in relation to how they spend their budgets. Police must be and must be seen to be having the sort of impact upon serious and organised crime that inspires the confidence of the community and the government, while at the same time exhibiting prudent and effective financial management. Agencies must be able to justify what they spend their money on and why some matters receive funding while others do not. They must essentially be able to account for their prioritisation, given that there are finite resources. My colleague Shane Nielsen has spoken about the application of the risk assessment process to criminal markets, while, as Judy has discussed, I'll be focusing on the threat and risk assessment as it relates to specific criminal targets, the individuals and groups that pose a threat to Australia, or the WHO, as we put it. In this context, a rigorous and robust threat and risk assessment process can be an invaluable tool for decision makers, allowing them to do the following things. Now, for our international visitors, I just wanted to explain the Australian context here. Australia is a collection of federated states and territories, each of which has its own independent police service, and you can see there the spread of those across the country. In addition to those state and territory jurisdictions, there is also the New South Wales Crime Commission, the Queensland CMC, the AFP, Australian Customs and Border Protection. And all of these agencies are partner agents for the ACC, and we work with all of them in both an operational capacity and in an intelligence sharing capacity. The role of the ACC in this environment is quite unique. Unlike our partner agencies, we don't undertake investigations or operational activity on our own. Everything we do is done with the support, cooperation and involvement of our partner agencies. From an intelligence perspective, our outputs, including threat and risk assessments, could not be produced without the contributions of these same partner agencies. From a threat assessment perspective, we're largely a service provider. We gather target data from all of our disparate partners and generate a nationally consistent risk rating for those targets. Now, the point in the middle is the most important one here. We work in partnership with other law enforcement agencies to develop a national understanding of serious and organised crime, to provide target information for action by partner agencies and to predict future criminal trends. And that captures there both the operational and the strategic flavour of what it is that we do in the threat assessment team. The target risk assessment methodology, or the Tram as it's known within the ACC, the concept of that underpins the protocol on multi-jurisdictional investigations recently issued by ANSPA, or the Australian New Zealand Police Advisory Agency, to which all state and territory police, the AFP and the ACC are party. A key element of that protocol is the agreement that, quote, all parties to this protocol will apply a nationally consistent threat or risk assessment methodology to the management of targets. And this is important because the ACC's Tram reflects the role that it has as a national risk assessment framework in a number of ways. Firstly, it has to be applicable to all crime types, and those are the crime types that are represented both from a Commonwealth perspective as well as a state perspective. For example, we need to be able to objectively compare the risk represented to the community from profit-based offences such as drug trafficking with non-profit-based offences such as child sex offences. It has to generate a credible, nationally consistent risk rating that's acceptable to all of our partner agencies. And the tool that we use to assess risk must be understood and trusted by our partner agencies, or the risk ratings that we arrive at are just not going to be taken seriously. And also, importantly, it needs to be exclusive of prioritisation factors. And while some Australian law enforcement agencies have their own risk assessment tools, generally these tools include a prioritisation framework that's relevant to the needs of that particular agency. For example, an agency may consider a target to be high risk as they're engaged in activities that harm the community, but they would also impact on the reputation of that particular agency if those activities were not to be disrupted. And as the ACC has such a broad range of different partners, each with jurisdictionally based imperatives, it wouldn't be appropriate for us to dictate which targets had priority for joint targeting activity. Rather, the Tram and the risk assessment that it generates provides our partners with a pure risk rating with priority for action to be taken against those targets to be decided by those agencies or negotiated with those agencies in the case of joint operational work. And finally, it has to comply with international standards. So you can see there how the role of the ACC as a sort of independent arbiter or as a sort of central intelligence sort of body has impacted quite significantly on the way that our risk assessment tool and methodologies have evolved. In terms of the equation itself, it complies with the usual equation that you would all have seen, in that risk equals threat plus impact. In this context, threat equals capability and intent, and our impact is measured by the harms, which Shane has referred to before, which are the political, social and financial impact of crime issues on Australian society. And in terms of the scale of activity, we've measured that in the Tram by a dollar figure on the illicit profits that are believed to be generated by the activity. And the reason for that is that that's based on the premises that the larger the profits that are generated over a fixed period of time, the larger the scale of that activity is likely to be. Now, the harm statements, as you can see there, are compiled from a range of different sources and follow a 5-point scale. The Tram is used within the ACC to risk assess all nationally significant criminal targets, both submitted to and generated by the ACC. And the Tram form itself, it's quite a detailed sort of collection form with a range of fields against which you can enter data or sort of click boxes or click down boxes to indicate some responses to questions. But it's optimised to collect against those fields that generate a risk rating, but also to allow for strategic analysis of trends and patterns in relation to the criminal threat and risk environment in Australia. For example, the form collects data on the resilience of the targets, their primary operating structures, the use of professional or criminal facilitators, and those types of issues. The form collects data on key individuals in addition to groups, permitting network analysis and the identification of key criminal nodes and facilitators, as our colleague was referring to before. The Tram template is embedded within the collection template for the National Criminal Target Report, or the NCTR as it's known, which is perhaps the primary vehicle through which the benefits of the Tram can be realised. The NCTR provides important strategic and operational focus to the ACC board. And the ACC board, for those who don't know, has all of the commissioners from each of the jurisdictions represented on it. And it provides advice to them in relation to the national criminal threat and risk picture. It comprises both strategic reporting at the national and regional level and furnishes a national criminal target analysis or a risk-ranked picture of all known, currently active, serious and organised crime targets impacting on Australia. And a nationally coordinated response is permitted by the visibility that the NCTR provides as to the nature and scope of criminal threats impacting on Australia, the geographic spread of those threats and the risk that they pose to the community. The heads of all law enforcement agencies in Australia can then collectively discuss the options for addressing these threats, with solutions increasingly involving collegiate approaches to tackling long-standing, resilient and entrenched high-risk targets. The NCTR represents the benefit of pooled knowledge. For example, this year, all jurisdictions that contributed to the NCTR collection process increased their identified pool of known serious organised crime targets by at least 50%. In the future, it's envisaged that data pertaining to new criminal targets will be submitted to the ACC on a real-time basis under what's known as a contemporaneous reporting regime. Such a regime, which is again addressed in the previously mentioned ANSPAR protocol, would allow the ACC to provide partner agencies and the government with real-time advice as to the criminal risk and threat picture in Australia, enabling agile, responsive and informed decision-making to combat those threats. So that's a quick snapshot of what we're doing at the moment and where we're heading. And I'll hand over to Judy for the next.